When Guy Fawkes mounted those wooden steps on January 31, 1606, he bore a secret that would shield him from one of history's most savage executions. What unfolded next would enter legend, yet the genuine terror of what he faced, and narrowly evaded, stands as one of the darkest episodes in the records of English justice. The figure we commemorate every November 5th was marked for a death so vicious that even seasoned executioners later called it inhuman. Most know Guy Fawkes today as the face behind the mask, the emblem of revolt made famous in modern times, but the actual account of his last moments exposes a cruelty few can truly grasp. The execution devised for Fawkes was never merely about taking a life. It existed to deliver a warning through deliberate, extended torment that would resound across centuries. The scaffold erected for Fawkes in the old palace yard of London had been built expressly for prolonged anguish. Every timber, every cord, every blade had been chosen with care so his death would progress in phases, each worse than the one before. On that frigid January morning the crowd assembled expecting hours of calculated torture, a spectacle that doubled as both amusement and deterrent. Instead they saw a flash of raw defiance that deprived the crown of its planned display of total dominion. Fawkes's last gesture would refuse King James I the pleasure of a lingering, screaming death, yet it would also secure his name forever as a man who seized his own end rather than yield to the measured savagery of Tudor-era justice. The real dread of what Guy Fawkes was meant to suffer goes far beyond what most history books are willing to spell out. The penalty laid down by law for high treason was not simply brutal, it had been crafted by men who understood anatomy and the mind, intent on prolonging agony while keeping the victim awake as long as humanly possible. To grasp the full measure of what awaited Fawkes, we must return to an age when public execution served as both justice and public amusement, when the boundary between law and torment had been deliberately rubbed out, and when royal power was upheld by spectacles of unthinkable cruelty. The England of 1605 was a tinderbox of religious hatred where Catholics lived in perpetual suspicion and Protestant rule demanded unquestioning obedience. King James I had taken the throne only 2 years earlier, inheriting a realm where faith decided not merely status but survival. From that climate of persecution sprang the Gunpowder Plot, hatched by men who believed violence was their sole remaining route to religious liberty. Guy Fawkes, a Yorkshire Catholic convert, had already shown his devotion by soldiering for Catholic Spain in the Low Countries. His battlefield skills made him priceless to the conspirators, and they also doomed him once the scheme collapsed. Robert Catesby, the plot's architect, had sought out Fawkes precisely for his expertise with explosives and his readiness to die for the cause. The design was breathtakingly bold, 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough to obliterate the House of Lords and kill King James I, his heirs, and almost the entire Protestant aristocracy in one cataclysmic blast. The detonation would have shaken all London, heralding a Catholic rising the plotters trusted would return England to Rome. Yet the uncovering of the plot on November 5, 1605 turned potential triumph into a nightmare of arrest and torment. Fawkes was seized in the Undercroft beneath Parliament amid explosives that could have flattened city blocks. His capture set in motion a centuries-honed apparatus of justice built to shatter both flesh and soul. Guy Fawkes's questioning began at once, using techniques the Tower of London's torturers had perfected over generations. Rack, Scavenger's daughter, and manacles were applied in careful sequence, each round meant to wring out not only confessions but the names of every accomplice and the breadth of the Catholic underground. King James himself authorized the gentler tortures to be used first, a phrase that lays bare the cold calculation of Tudor interrogation. The escalation from mild to extreme was deliberate, intended to break a man slowly while keeping him lucid enough to talk. For days Fawkes withstood this methodical ruin of his body, his signatures on confessions grew ever shakier as the rack crushed his hands. The documents preserved in the National Archives bear mute witness to a campaign of cruelty that never paused until the day of execution. The sentence, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was the supreme expression of judicial terror in English law, reserved solely for high treason. This was no simple killing. It was an elaborately staged ceremony of annihilation that could stretch across hours, created to prove the crown's dominion over life, death, and human dignity itself. The ritual opened with the condemned man dragged behind a horse on a hurdle through jeering streets, stripped of any last shred of pride. Cobblestones ripped clothes and skin while the mob hurled filth and stones, starting the public shaming that would peak at the gallows. Once there, the traitor was half-hanged, hoisted just long enough to choke but not to black out or die. The hangman's art was to judge the exact second to cut him down, leaving the victim fully aware for what came next. The drawing began with stripping, then the slitting of the living belly. The executioner would plunge his hand inside and pull out the intestines, often burning them in a brazier while the victim watched. Eyewitnesses recorded men who stayed conscious through it all, their cries ringing over the crowd as their bodies were taken apart piece by piece. Quartering followed with equal precision. 4 horses were hitched to the limbs, though in practice axes and knives did the work, human joints resisted tearing. The executioner hacked through bone and tendon while the heart still beat, prolonging awareness as long as anatomy allowed. The last outrage was the public exhibition of head and quarters, spiked on London Bridge and city gates, a rotting forest of warning to every passerby. This punishment had been honed across centuries, every detail calibrated to maximize bodily pain and psychic horror. The crowds who flocked to watch were not just idly entertained, they were taking part in a sacred rite that reaffirmed the monarch's absolute might through the destruction of a human being. The Tower of London in 1605 was far more than a castle, it was a factory of confession and despair. Its torture chambers held instruments refined by long practice, each engineered to deliver precise torment while preserving the victim's ability to speak. The rack, the most notorious, was a simple frame that could pop every joint through slow, relentless stretching. Wrists and ankles were bound, then winches turned until ligaments tore, sockets burst, and finally bones cracked. Fawkes endured repeated sessions, each calibrated to harvest information while keeping him fit for public slaughter. Tower records chart the ruin of his hands, a once bold signature dissolving into feeble scrawls. The Scavenger's daughter did the opposite, crushing the body into a ball until ribs snapped and breath came in gasps. It excelled at breaking those who had withstood the rack's pulling agonies. Manacles offered quieter torment, victims dangled by the wrists for days, shoulders dislocating, hands turning black from lost circulation and permanent nerve death. The Tower's torturers were masters of their craft, knowing exactly how far to push before the prisoner fainted, when to ease off, when to resume. Their aim was not mere pain but the collapse of the human spirit while leaving the body intact enough to betray others. Between sessions prisoners were flung back into icy, cramped cells with barely any food or water, so that every dawn brought fresh weakness and dread. January 31, 1606 broke cold and grey, frost silvering London's stones. Guy Fawkes woke in his Tower cell knowing this day would kill him, yet the exact manner of his dying had haunted every sleepless night since sentence was passed. For days the hammers of carpenters had echoed as they built the high scaffold that would stage his slow death. The journey from Tower to Old Palace Yard was one last parade of shame. Fawkes and the surviving plotters, Thomas Winter, Ambrose Rookwood, and Robert Keyes, were hauled on hurdles through streets thronged with jeering holidaymakers. Old Palace Yard had become a theatre of death, the gallows raised extra high so no one would miss a moment of the hours to come. The hooded executioner had laid out his tools with care, noose set to strangle but not kill, knives honed to razor sharpness, brazier glowing for the entrails. The crowd hushed as the ritual everyone knew by heart began again. Winter went first, then Rookwood, then Keyes, each man half-hanged, cut down alive, gutted and quartered while his screams still rang. Their deaths were dress rehearsals for Fawkes, the last and most notorious of the four. Weak from torture, Fawkes could barely stand as guards pushed him up the steps. The executioner adjusted the rope, positioning his victim perfectly. But in that instant, with the full roadmap of agony clear in his mind, having just watched his friends dismantled alive, Fawkes made his choice. Instead of waiting for the prescribed torment, he gathered the last of his strength and hurled himself from the platform. His body dropped the full height of the tall scaffold and struck the stones below with a crack that snapped his neck instantly. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, quickly turning to mutters of frustration. The show was over almost before it began. The executioner, robbed of a living subject, could only perform on a corpse. The law still demanded its full course, so the lifeless body was hoisted, slit open, disemboweled, and quartered. But the heart of the punishment, the conscious suffering, had been snatched away by one leap of defiance. Asterisk the thousands packed into Old Palace Yard that morning mirrored London itself, merchants who had paid for prime seats, labourers who had queued since dawn. Their reaction laid bare the strange bond between justice and spectacle in Stuart England. Some felt cheated of their expected entertainment, others, almost despite themselves, admired the nerve it took to cheat the hangman. Asterisk news of Fawkes's leap raced across the country, growing taller with every telling until the failed plotter began his slow metamorphosis into folk hero. King James's rage was icy. The elaborate execution meant to cow all future traitors had been turned into proof that even at the gallows a man could still defy the crown. Asterisk Parliament hastily altered scaffold design, no more high platforms, extra guards to stop any repeat performance. Foreign ambassadors wrote home that English justice, for all its brutality, had been outwitted at the last moment. Catholic Europe hailed Fawkes as a martyr who chose death over heresy's torture. Protestant scribes branded his suicide damnable cowardice. Asterisk bonfires lit every November 5th began as celebrations of Protestant deliverance, effigies of Guy consigned to the flames amid prayers of thanksgiving. Over centuries the night lost its sharp religious edge, becoming first a patriotic festival, then a general autumn carnival. Fireworks replaced hellfire, and by the 20th century the Guy Fawkes mask, once burned in hatred, was worn by protesters the world over as a sign of resistance. Asterisk the leap from that scaffold in 1606 still forces us to look straight at what a state will do when it decides terror is policy. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was abolished only in 1870, and many credit the lingering memory of men like Fawkes, men who refused to play their assigned role in the theatre of cruelty, for helping turn the tide of public feeling. Asterisk 400 years on, as we light bonfires or watch fireworks streak across November skies, the story still asks the same hard questions: where does justice end and vengeance begin? How much pain is a state entitled to inflict in the name of order? And what does it say about human dignity that, even when every circumstance is engineered for humiliation and agony, a person can still find one final, untouchable instant of control? Asterisk Guy Fawkes did not succeed in blowing up Parliament, but on a frozen January morning he succeeded in something else. He proved that cruelty, no matter how meticulously planned, cannot always command the last word. That single act of choice, made at the edge of the abyss, remains one of history's clearest reminders that the human spirit, though it can be battered almost beyond recognition, is never entirely in another's power. Asterisk and that, more than any explosion, is why we still say his name.